I'm Charlie Hudson. I'm from the Sumner Community Residents Association. Tenekoto, thank you very much for coming along this evening. So tonight, this is all about how we're going to, really it's about learning how climate change and sea level rise will affect our coastal communities. On behalf of our community, I would like to give huge thanks to our representatives from Christchurch City Council and to Warwick Schaefer from the Christchurch Coastal Residents United, which is CCRU, which I'll refer to as later. So they're going to be speaking to us tonight. SCRA, which is us, we have a really good working relationship with Christchurch City Council, but we're also aware that we want to open up the conversation with CCRU, who advocate on issues of climate change. Warwick will be speaking from years of experience working in communities affected by coastal hazards, and Christchurch City Council will be speaking to the recently released Coastal Hazard Adaptation Framework and the Coastal Hazard Plan Changes, Issues and Options. This is a really big body of work for New Zealand, and it's important that everyone is able to have access to the information to keep them comfortable with the changes that will come. And I'd like to stress that he waka eke noa, we're all in this together.
Thank you first to Sumner for hosting this. We do these presentations, I aim to do them once a month, and well, that's been stopped a few times. But thank you very much for putting this on in such a wonderful location. I just want to also mention, to shout out to the council staff. We've worked with them a lot over the years, and they've been really wonderful to work with. They've answered a lot of our difficult questions, and I find them highly professional and good to work with. And while I've got some criticisms to make, I guess, it's certainly not a personal thing. They're working in a difficult situation on a very difficult thing, and it's about trying to make this right and better. So the Tonkin and Taylor Coastal Hazards Assessment has been released along with the Adaptation framework. There's an issue that I'd like to, there's a lot in this report, so obviously I can't talk all about it. I'm not the best person to talk all about it, but there's one thing that we've been talking about for years, and I want to sort of concentrate on that now because it is a pretty big issue, and I think that's something we should be stopping and talking about and thinking about, and that's the use of a scenario called RCP 8.5, and I will explain more about that and give you some detail about it, so bear with me as I work my way through that. We've been saying for years that this is an unlikely scenario and shouldn't be used or sold as a likely scenario in planning, and recently the IPCC have come out and made that quite clear and said that it's a low likelihood or implausible scenario, and I'll get into that more deeply. Why is this a problem for homeowners? When this scenario is used in mapping, basically what this scenario is the science behind a metre of sea level rise. Why is this a problem for homeowners? So if you use scenarios like this as likely, then a lot more people, when you're trying to map high hazard risk areas, a lot more people than should be get caught in hazard zones, and that has consequences. So if you have a hazard on your limb, then insurance becomes more difficult. Building potentially becomes more difficult. Banking or getting a loan becomes more difficult, and potentially that can lead to a loss of confidence in a community. So for communities, the stakes are high, and it's really important that we get this right. So the first point I want to make is that the world is warming. There's absolutely no doubt about that. The sea is rising. There's absolutely no doubt about that either. And the IPCC in the latest report have made it very clear that from the 60s, this warming has been driven by human activity. I'll just put my glasses on as well so I can see a bit better. They're not actually my glasses, they're my wife's. I wanted to talk a little bit about liability, understanding liability and costs. But actually what this really means is understanding each other. And again, it goes back to this idea of a balancing act. So a city council is concerned about liability. city councillors are concerned about liability. Part of that is potentially not wanting to get sued by people who are getting washed away in the future, but I would also say that they just simply don't want people in harm's way. So they mitigate that risk by preventing people building in risky places. It's completely a normal and right thing to do. Now, the trouble with it is understanding risk and working it out. So from the homeowner's side or the property owner's side, when you have a hazard, let's just say you are put into a hazard zone, it costs you, as I was saying, banking, insurance, having someone to buy your home. We know it quite well because we've experienced for about the last, how many years? 5 years, 10 years in South Shore. It's been kind of the middle of it, and we went through a period where no one could build their houses. And it's incredibly tough on a community, and I know a lot of people that would have liked to move there but are too scared to, or now can't because the bank simply says no, we're not lending in these areas. And I just heard about examples as I was coming over from someone who's had their insurance pulled because they're in a hazard zone area. So the costs for property owners are huge. So what we've got here is a balancing act. And the thing about a balancing act is it's really important to get it right. So it's really important that the modelling and the science is right. And a good, shall we say, debate goes on from between the two sides that have most to lose, shall we say. So think of it as a partnership working out the right thing. Now, just go back to this here. The sea is rising. I have it on good authority that it's going to rise many, many metres. In fact, apparently there's signs of beach in around the middle of Christchurch where it once was. So this is not a question of if we will be inundated, it's a question of when we will be inundated. So the trick of this is about actually when to move and when to stop building in an area. For example, right now, we know, or let's assume the sea's going to rise many metres, Cathedral Square will be inundated. Should we stop building there now? Stop all the redevelopment in Cashel Street now? Well, obviously no. There's many, many millennia that you can usually use that ground. But where is that line? Where should the line be drawn? And that's really what this is all about. This started way back in 2013 or 2015. I just wanted to touch on what I think went wrong that time and how we're doing it better this time. What went wrong was that in the rush, I think, after the earthquakes, a very high sea level rise was selected, 1 metre, based on the RCP 8.5, which I will explain, bear with me. On top of that was added a 1 in 500 year flood event, and on top of that was a 16% rain increase, and then a 1 in 50 year high tide event. Now that's slightly from memory, so happy to be corrected. I should also have said at the very beginning, I think I'm not an expert in this, so I'm happy to be corrected, and when the team come on after me, they may be able to correct some of the things that I've said, but like I say, it's all about getting to the truth. This then was rushed through a fast-track process with no consultation really. People didn't know what was happening until it had happened, and it caused a lot of problems, upheaval and disquiet, as we all know. So what's better this time? So this time, the engineers and scientists have taken a lot more time about what they're doing. The report is much more substantial. The consultation is far more substantial. even before this was released, we didn't know a lot about this report, but council staff had reached out to us to talk about a few things which we were able to put some feedback into. Not all, but some. And the process leading forward from here is extensive, I would say, really extensive, right to grassroots level. So those bits are much improved. So yeah, I think kudos to the team at council for that. Remaining concerns and some suggestions are the continued use of RCP 8.5. I would qualify that as being presented as a likely scenario. And we'll go into that a bit more. I think there's still a lack of clarity for me around other assumptions. Now that may be buried in the report. I went through so many reports last weekend trying to put this thing together, and I may have missed it. But what is in the modelling in addition to that metre sea level rise? I think that needs to be made clear. The assumptions in general in these models need to be made clear because they're extremely important and they need to be communicated in a very balanced way. I think the loss of a citywide view is a shame. Like we can see here, this button, just this wee zone is visible when you look at the map thing. I think it was really nice to see back in the old days, you could kind of see how far and wide it went. I think that's helpful. It's a whole city problem, and it's helpful to see where in the city it actually goes completely, so we can have a broader conversation as well as the micro conversations in communities. And this time the levels are much higher, so it's going to be spread much further than what we see here, and it will be quite good to know the boundaries this time at a high level. Okay, 8.5, what's an RCP? Who here actually has heard of this before, or doesn't know, dare I ask? So RCP stands for Representative Concentration Pathway, and it's better described, I think, as like a vision for a social future. How are we going to live on Earth for the next 100 years? Are we going to buy electric cars, put solar on our roof, put up wind farms, stop burning gasoline and particularly coal, and reduce our carbon emissions? Or are we going to, is our population going to explode, and are we going to go to coal for our main source of energy and put a lot of carbon into the atmosphere? So that's what these scenarios really are about. Ooh, scared to push the button. So the top one here is 8.5, and the best case down here is 2.6, which basically equals the amount of heating imbalance that you'll get from this amount of CO2 trapping energy. So that's what these are. 8.5 is the top one, and just while we're here, just take note of this middle path through here and this top path here. So IPCC have come out recently, as I was saying in the intro, and said that the likelihood of the likelihood of the high emission scenarios, such as 8.5, and in the new AR6 it's called SSP 8.5, is considered low. Also in the same IPCC AR6 report, high-end scenarios 8.5 have recently been argued to be implausible to unfold. And I'll show you why, and I actually went and read this paper and the one that it referenced, and it was really interesting. I encourage everybody to do that. The only reason, well, a good reason why that's still in is backwards compatibility with AR5 makes sense. It's nothing wrong with that science. It should be there. We should be understanding the extremes. We just don't need to use them to stop people adding a room to their house. So the next bit, into planning now. Mark is going to be able to say something about this, possibly. This is what the council has to obey. Like we have to obey the road rules, the council has to obey these policy statements. And this is the New Zealand Coastal Policy Statement. And the reason we're going through this process is that the council is not compliant with this at the moment and must do it. Is that correct? Good, that's correct. Here are the key bits, as I understand it. Policy 24, areas at high risk of being affected need to be identified. Okay, so the key point here is high risk, areas of high risk. The other bits of it that I think are important are the identification of these risks is to take into account national guidance and best available information on the likely effects. So likely effects is a very important word as well. And the other bits of it I think are important, well, that national guidance and the best available information. So best available information has to include the IPCC. That is the authority in this case, and actually what local authorities or national guidance usually references. We could be stuck in a bit of a time where our national guidance is just lagging behind a little bit, and maybe that's something to try and fix or clarify. So this is a Tonkin and Taylor assessment and what they have to say about RPC 8.5 and the national guidance, actually, by the look of it. The national guidance recommends focusing on the high sea level rise scenario, technical term used in climate sciences, RCP 8.5, for the first stage of risk screening. So that was that top bit of that policy 24. And they go on to say that the emissions, this reflects global emissions continuing at the present rate and is most aligned with our current trajectory of emissions. Sounds like the one. There's also this sentence down here in the report. It is predicted that New Zealand will experience 30 centimetres of sea level rise by 2050, 50 centimetres of sea level rise by 2075, and 1 metre by 21, I think there's a typo in their report, I'm pretty sure that should be 2115. That's fine. Right. So it is true to say we are on the 8.5 path. That's a correct statement, it's not a lie, but I put it to you that is actually a little misleading because the paths are pretty much on top of each other at the moment. It's very difficult to tell where we are at the moment. So to put something like that in and not qualify it, I don't think that is being completely an honest broker, as they would say in the science business. It would be reasonable to also say on the same grounds we are on the pathway to 6.0, 4.5 and 2.6. Would be equally misleading. Now, actually, I'll show you something, little detail I found here in my extra slides that I had to cut out because Karina said I had too many graphs. If you look down here, if you go to NOAA, they have the real-time concentration of atmospheric carbon dioxide, real time. And currently it is 413 parts per million. If you really squint, you would probably say 413 parts per million. It's actually closer to the lower side than the upper side there of that 8.5. It's starting to depart. But you would never draw that conclusion. It would just be absolutely wrong to do that because the paths are just too close at the moment. We cannot say. This is the RPCs as they are presented in the Tonkin Taylor report. Now, Tonkin Taylor have got these from MFE. The clever New Zealanders have added another one. RPC 8.5 plus. This is not in the actual IPCC documents at all. This here is the medium middle of the 8.5 I was showing you before. I'll go back. Oh, this is great. So you think about this here. So the very top of this here, the 85% of quartile, is what we in New Zealand have turned into 8.5 plus. Right. What this sort of does from a layman's perspective is that it makes 8.5 look kind of like high but middle, middle, medium, slightly on the safe side. A good thing to focus on for, putting people in hazard zones and being safe. And then below this we have the other scenarios, 4.6 and that's 6.0 and 4.5 I'm guessing. I don't think 2.6 is probably in here. This is a table from the Tonkin and Taylor paper talking about the scenarios, and it says at the top, sea level rise scenarios from national guidance. I looked through national guidance for this table and I cannot find it anywhere. I'll show you what I did find, and happy to be proved wrong in terms of it is there somewhere. But mind you, I didn't have much time to do this. But what it says here is this scenario and other M scenarios below assume that a warming has a more moderate effect on sea levels. It uses a projection in the middle of the likely range for sea level response to warming caused by emissions. If you gave this to a panel of residents who didn't know too much science, they would think, oh, well, that's what we're in for, isn't it? If you read through this chart, like words like median estimate, and that's kind of a scientific term, you possibly might just mistake it for, medium. I think it would be charitable here, and possibly it's written by, experts who kind of know what they're talking about here. And I just think it needs to be tuned to communicate more clearly to lay people about what this really is. If you gave, I couldn't fit all of these on the slide, but if you, the other ones, the lower scenarios are there as well. But if you handed this to unsuspecting locals in Sumner, asked them to tick which one was likely, I'm pretty sure they'd all tick this. This is what I did find in MFE about the guidance on 8.5. RCP 8.5, continuing high emission baseline scenario. I do happen to know a bit about MFE guidance because we spent a lot of time when they were releasing it, but that was a long time ago. And RCP 8.5 world would exhibit slow rates of economic development, slow uptake of technology, world population estimated to reach 13 billion. That's a very high estimate, actually. It's probably a bit unlikely. Slow uptake of technology, and what that really means is we're not going to develop energy alternatives very fast under this scenario. Now, MFE could have said more, in my opinion, about this, so I'll take you a little bit further. This is kind of how the council sees this scenario at the moment. So where a single scenario is required, we take advice from MFE and IPCC, who explicitly advise that RCP 8.5 is the scenario most aligned with the current trajectory of global emissions. So what they've done with the modelling this time is actually they've given a whole range of sea level rise. So there's actually a slider where you can look at increments of 100 all the way up to 2 metres, which is excellent, rather than just one like it was before. But for some things you need one. What are you going to do for limbs, for example? And there'll be other cases where you actually need to use, you have to use one. And where that is required, this is currently the one. And what I'm arguing is that it shouldn't be. So the IPCC has said that this is implausible, and I'll tell you why. Emissions pathways to get to RPC for RPC 8.5 generally require an unprecedented five-fold increase in coal use. So we are going to stop burning petrol, we're going to burn coal. That's what we're going to do. By the end of the century, an amount larger than some estimates of recoverable coal reserves. We are going to burn more coal than exists on Earth. Now, it's not bad science. It's there to find the extremes, but it should not be taken and used in this way in planning and communicated like this. And I think this is why IPCC have come out and clarified. Okay, so that paper that I had up, that slide I had up before, was a paper in Nature and referenced by the IPCC. And that paper in Nature references this paper, which I thoroughly encourage reading because it's excellent, by Justin Ritchie. Here's a graph showing our trajectory of where we get our energy from over the next 100 years under this 8.5 scenario. So we are here in 2020. By 2100, we are going to use need or use 3 times the energy we are now. Remember the population, it's gone to 13 billion. We need a lot more energy. What are we going to do? We're going to replace oil with coal. So the portion of coal in that energy spectrum increases. We are going to reduce the use of gas and use more coal. We're going to really hit the nuclear button. And because of, remember that lack of innovation and that assumption, we're not going to have so much wind and solar under this scenario. It's not really a scenario that's plausible to unfold given where we are now. Now, back in the 90s, it was a different story when they first came up with these concepts. Back then, they'd come out of the 70s and had a fuel shock, oil shock, and they were thinking, oh my God, where are we going to get our energy? I know, boundless coal reserves, we're going to use them. And that's where the seed of this all came from. So, in 2015, we have a much better idea of how much coal reserves exist in the world, and you can see that there's not enough for any of these scenarios. We will actually, if we tried to, we would run out of coal. Now, I think a really interesting thing to make clear as well is business as usual. So business as usual has been really misused in my opinion. What it really means is a no mitigation strategy. So that's where carbon price is zero. We have no climate policy. So these lines here at the top are no mitigation strategies, 8.5, all of them, and then the dotted ones are the ones with mitigation down below. So the key point here is that this scenario is simply implausible because of all these things. Now, it doesn't make scenarios wrong, it doesn't make any of them wrong, it just means that when it comes to assessing high risk for hazards, this is not the one to use. I would suggest 2.6 or 4.5. 0.6 or 4 should be the ones focused on. Right, so almost at the end. The other part, I've spent a lot of time on this particular 8.5, but there are other things. In the original, we had these high flood events, rainfall increase, etc., on top of that sea level rise. So the great thing here with this new WYSIWYG website they've got is you can put sea level at 0, i.e. what's it like now? So I did that, and here's Sumner with a lot of flooding at the moment. Now, I know it floods, mainly I think it's your drain pipes, isn't it? Your drain pipes are a problem over here when they get blocked, but I don't think we're getting this kind of flooding in Sumner at the moment. So
What flood is that?
that's what you've got now.
Is that an annual flood?
Well, it's not annual, you see, that's what I'm saying. It's these, yes. So it's these assumptions on top of this. So you're not getting that all the time, but the thing is, you're getting hazard zones based on this potentially, and potentially building restrictions. So these assumptions need to be made really clear, and there needs to be discussion about it. I think it was a real loss when there wasn't community representation allowed on the working group, where these questions could have been asked and worked out over a longer period of time rather than rushed over a weekend and into a meeting like this. In the hearing panel, on the first round, the judge asked the council to map 0 sea level rise, 0.5 sea level rise, because they had one. They wanted to know what it would be like under other scenarios. When they did that, they got, at 0.5 metre sea level rise, they got this amount of flooding here. There's quite clearly a huge difference between that modelling and this modelling, and I'm told that's because the current modelling's up to date, but as a community it'd be really good to know, because there's a big difference there, and a big difference in how many people are affected and have these hazard zones. Again, it's about making sure it's right. The process, the adaptation process, has these coastal panel of people from each community and a stag. I think this is excellent. And I think the framework is good. Everything's good about this process, but it could also go wrong if the wrong information is provided. But the framework itself is excellent. And I like this bit of it. I think what's really important, particularly this stag, is that these advisors are trusted by the community, and I would advocate for the community having a say on at least 50% of them. Remember, this is a balancing act here between two parties with legitimate interests. So I think that would be really healthy, actually. And I think the community panels, the lay folk on these, who are getting information from these guys, should be elected completely by affected community. That's just my 2 cents on that. So, final slide. 8.5, my conclusions or wishes, my wish list, should we call it that? 8.5 should be removed from the hazard assessment. So we shouldn't be assessing hazards using this one. The latest science should be used. Now, I can accept that the council might be in a bit of a bind here because they've got local guidance, which potentially is not quite saying the same thing. So one thing I have proposed is potentially, as a community, with council, we go to MFE and try and get them to clarify, given the new situation and the new information. That's an idea, perhaps. If the RPC can't be removed, language in the report should be amended to be more balanced, in my opinion. Model assumptions need to be more clear, well, need to be published. Maybe they're in there, but I couldn't find them. Affected communities should have equal rights with CCC when it comes to appointing members of the STAG. Affected communities should be able to appoint members to the community panel. Final point is that I think there's more time needed for feedback. This has been with council for years. I mean, they've got a lot of work to do, so no begrudging that, and they've got through a lot in that time. But it's the 15th of November is when we have to put feedback in, and it's really not much time for people to get together, to talk, to swap notes. I think we should have a little bit of a pause here and a bit more time to put considered feedback in, because there's quite a lot to digest and get your head around. Thank you very much for your time.
So I'd really like to thank Warwick for sharing his thoughts. There was a lot of valuable information in there, and hopefully some of what we present tonight will provide some clarifications or at least a different perspective on some of this. I'm also hoping and expecting that you'll put your submission in writing as well, so if we can't get to all of the detail tonight, we'll have time to consider it once the submission's closed. I guess I would note that there's a lot of discussion and debate about the science. And, that's a valid conversation to have, and it's a conversation we've been having with Warwick for a while, and as he's pointed out, and I'm sure we'll continue to have further discussions and debates, which is great. We've got Derek here tonight to address some of those questions. I guess we're trying to shift the conversation a little bit away from debating the detail of the science, however, because we're at the process at the moment of seeking feedback on how council and communities can work together to plan for our future, and we're sort of hoping to get a little bit of feedback about that as opposed to just discussing the science. So with that in mind, we are in an engagement phase at the moment. We've been in an engagement phase since the 8th of October, and it does go through to the 15th of November, and we're really keen for everyone here tonight to jump on the website and give us your feedback. We'll be putting up the links several times during the presentation. So Council is engaging in a sort of comprehensive way around coastal hazards management. So we have three aspects to this engagement. We have the coastal hazards assessment by Tonkin and Taylor, and Mikey and Derek will be talking you through some of that information tonight. That's been released for information. But as I say, we're really seeking feedback on the other two components of the engagement. And one is the coastal adaptation framework that I'll be presenting on tonight, and the other is the coastal hazards plan change issues and options paper. And Mark Stevenson will be presenting on that tonight. So hopefully you get a bit of a sense about the total of the package that we're seeking feedback on. We know that in the past we've been criticised for engaging late in the process. We are starting this engagement very early, so there is a lot of opportunity to influence the direction of this work, and that's really what we're hoping to hear from you about tonight, and when you hopefully put submissions in. So I wish I had Warwick's wife's glasses, because my sight's not great either. I don't know, maybe not. I have spare. It might not work. But I think we all agree that the sea levels are rising, and we can debate the rate in detail, but we do have these figures on the slide here, which are the ones that are generally accepted in New Zealand. The issue that we have in Christchurch is that we have a very long, low-lying coastline. And we have a lot of property and infrastructure along that coastline. And I just wondered, does anyone know how long our coastline is at the district? Does anyone want to have a guess? Come on, someone throw a number out.
34 kilometres.
The whole district? Nope. Yep. Count the lot. And the estuary as well. How much?
500.
Closer. 398. Yeah, so it's a very long coastline that we're dealing with here, and I guess that puts a little bit of this discussion in perspective, because we are dealing with areas right along that coastline, including Banks Peninsula, as the point has been made. We have a bit of an estimate of around about 25,000 properties that would be susceptible to flood risk over that 120 years of sea level rise. And we know that we have a large amount and large value of infrastructure located along our coastline. There's also some emerging research around insurance impacts for sea level rise, and Belinda Stories recently published some information in which she's suggesting that around about 5,000 properties could become susceptible to retreat, either full or partial insurance retreat over that next 30-year period. So we have a lot of upcoming issues, and that's really what we're trying to engage with you about. How do you want to work with council? What's the best way forward here? So we really are very much seeking feedback on these matters. This conversation hasn't been easy in the past, and it probably won't be easy in the future. It's really challenging, and we really acknowledge that for coastal communities who really care about their place and the place they live, this is a difficult conversation to have. So we've been listening to coastal communities and talking to people over the last couple of years as we set this process up. And there's a few things we're hoping to do differently. And I'd just reiterate the point that we're very much at the start of this process, so we are seeking feedback really early on. You'll hear a lot from Mikey about how we've really endeavoured to make the science quite simple to speak to a non-technical audience. We don't really feel that everyone should have to have a PhD in coastal geomorphology to understand this conversation. So we've spent a lot of time on that discussion, and we've had some input from Karina and Warwick on that as well. We're not just releasing this information, we're wanting to have these face-to-face discussions, hear people's views and take those views into account. We're wanting to understand a lot of different views. We're very keen to hear from coastal residents, but we think a really important part of this conversation is to be had with children and young people, with people who also have different perspectives about the coastal values. So people who care about the ecology, some people probably care a lot about infrastructure who don't work at council, but mostly it's council people who care about infrastructure. And you know, our economy. So there's a whole range of different voices and values that we need to hear about as we go through this process. And we are very much closely working with Ngāi Tahu from the outset. Now I'm going to hand over to Mikey and Derek to talk a little bit about the coastal hazards assessment.
So essentially what we were trying to achieve with this coastal hazard assessment was to provide really good comprehensive information about coastal flooding, about coastal erosion and rising groundwater before we embarked on these 2 programs of work that Jane's touched on already. We wanted to cover a really wide range of sea level rise scenarios, and Derek will touch on that a little bit more, and that was really around trying to move away from saying this exact climate change scenario, at this exact time frame, this is what's going to occur. So we wanted to be able to really understand the breadth of effects that could occur so that we knew what they were and we could apply that in different programs. We also really wanted an assessment that was accessible to a non-technical audience, and we've done a lot of work around plain English, different types of formats, and I'll talk about those a bit more as well. Essentially, this is the evidence base for those programs, but it doesn't mean that that's where it ends, and that's probably a really important point. So with our adaptation planning, it's going to be our base information that we keep going back to, and when we're looking at options in the future, we're looking at those increments and how they change and where those maybe thresholds are, where we start seeing some more significant change, where we really need to, I guess, have some responses and actions, and it helps us test those options as well. For the plan change, there was actually another piece of analysis that happened once our coastal hazard assessment was completed. And that looked at, well, what is a high risk area? What would that constitute? What amount of sea level rise should we be considering? And it's really worth having a read of that if that's something you're concerned with, because we are seeking feedback on that plan change work. And if we've got that completely wrong, we really want to know about it. So there are still opportunities in that space. We did this update because there was quite a bit of new technical information that we needed to consider. That includes information like the sediment supply information about how much sediment we expect to come from the Waimakariri. That was a NIWA report in 2018, and that's been incorporated into our modelling, and Derek will talk a bit more about that. We also had information about extreme water levels and how our understanding of those has changed. So we've been able to factor that into our flooding assessment as well. We also had new information on rising groundwater, and so we've been able to show that on the maps for the first time, and that's to ensure that when we have a conversation about flooding, we're also looking at other sources of flooding that are also being influenced by sea level rise. So if we look at this option, will it also deal with groundwater issues? So we're thinking about them comprehensively. Warwick, I'm not sure I managed to cover off everything that you touched on, but I'll try with a few where I've sort of picked up on them. The area you pointed out with the inland extent boundary, yes, I know it is frustrating that we haven't mapped everything further inland as well. I'm actually quite keen to get a static map up there that shows that there are effects further inland, so we're not creating a perception, I guess, that the effects don't go further, but it was a decision around our modelling, where our modelling is basically we used a different technique, and it's really great for trying to understand those incremental changes near the coast, but it's not so great as we move further inland because it doesn't factor in all those river influences which are more dominant up that side. So we've got the line there, we've got a technical basis for that line, but we will continue to talk about how there are effects further inland, and also we will need to do planning with those communities as well. So duly noted, your point there. I guess the other point to touch on here is where do we take this direction from? we ultimately do need to rely on the Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change and their recommendations, how the Ministry for the Environment then adopts that into their national guidance. Yes, there is an update in terms of the latest IPCC report, but that hasn't yet been turned into recommendations from MFE, and it is really hard for us to, I guess, on the side go and interpret that, come up with our own conclusions when we know there's some national work underway really quickly. We are trying to link in with them really closely. We know there's some research happening to do that translation, and so we will be keeping, I guess, our communities updated as that progresses, and we're very much going to be in the room as all councils hear a bit more about how that work's happening. We're contacting them and saying, please, please, please tell us as soon as possible. So watch this space. In terms of some of the outputs that we figure out one that I can actually read. We've got a real range of outputs because, as we said, we really want to communicate this information in a way that different people can understand. Or get what they want from that information as well. So for those of you that want to lose the will to live, and I'm sorry, Warwick, but you absolutely apply in this situation, but you have read the technical report and it's 150 pages long, and then it's got a whole bunch of appendices, and it's not a light read. And we know that for most people that's probably not the way that you want to engage with this information. So we have developed a summary report. It's about 25 pages long, and it is written by a non-technical writer. And I spent hours and hours with the scientists saying, look, could you please just explain that in a way that actually makes sense? Because no one really wants to, no one understands what you're saying. So we have tried. The information is accurate, but it's also hopefully easier to understand. At the back of that talks about our methodology, you know, the approach that we took and why. It does touch on some of those, maybe not as much as you would like, but some of the things that were input into the modelling, and Derek might be able to clarify a little bit further. Sorry, I'm throwing him under the bus here. And at the end of that summary report, we also have a number of area summaries. Now, those are 1 pages. They're A3s, and they touch on generally what methods were used and what are the key findings in the shorter and longer term for these areas. There's 6 across the whole district, and if you look at nothing else, it's a 1-pager, so I absolutely recommend having a read. We've also got our online portal. This is interactive, sliders, you can zoom in and out of the hazards. There's lots of little pop-ups as well to understand the information. So it's on our website. If you go to search coastal hazards and click on find out if my property is affected, it's definitely something that we'd recommend people have a look at. And then we've got a number of videos. Now Derek is starring in those and just explaining a little bit about what these hazards are and how they might impact different areas. We've got a 101 and then we've got a few area specific ones. And on that note, we'll play one of them now.
Which consists of over 700 scientists from 90 different countries. Christchurch City Council has recently updated their coastal hazard modelling and mapping, which is coastal flooding, coastal erosion, and raised coastal groundwater to deal with higher sea levels in the future. Until now, there's been a lack of work on how we respond or manage these impacts. And although we may not see some of those impacts for decades, there is a need to start planning now. We need to be proactive. And so the City Council is starting that conversation with their coastal communities on how we might respond to these coming challenges. Otatahi Christchurch has a long and very short in the A80 pedestrian. We have a large Banks Peninsula with numerous outer bays and 2 harbours, Littleton Harbour and Akaroa Harbour. And to the south, we have the large barrier of continental Spit. Now, Christchurch City is one of the most exposed cities in New Zealand to the sea level rise hazards. And if we think about the historical environment, that's not surprising, as it's comprised of old sand dunes and wetlands that have been drained to form the modern city. So what sorts of sea level rise are we talking about? So over the next 30 years, the projections are that we could have 20 centimetres to possibly up to 60 centimetres of increased sea level. If we look forward over 50 years, it could be somewhere between 60 centimetres to up to a metre. And over the longest term that we're looking at is 100 years, we could have somewhere between 1 metre to 1.5 metres. So that's going to come with impacts on coastal flooding, inability to drain groundwater, and with greater coastal erosion. Coastal flooding is caused by the combination of high astronomical tides, then raised sea levels on top of that due to low air pressure, the process called storm surge, and riding on top of that large waves from large wind events. And that raises our sea level above our normal tidal ranges. Now the Christchurch coast is already exposed to sea level flooding in very large events, but with sea level rise, that frequency of flooding and the extent of flooding and the depth of flooding is all likely to increase. So our key areas where those impacts will be felt are the low areas around Brooklands Lagoon, the low areas around the Avon Heathcote Estuary and up the lower Heathcote and lower Avon rivers, and the low-lying heads of the bays at the top of Littleton Harbour and the top of Akaroa Harbour, and some of our outer bays such as O'Kane's. When we have storm events with elevated sea level, we normally have very large waves. Those seas can ride further into the coast and they end up eroding our dune systems, and this already occurs. Our sediment supply is reasonably plentiful to the Canterbury coast and the Waimakariri River, and we get growth back of our dunes. So in the very long term, our dunes have been growing. But with sea level rise, the frequency of those attacks on that dune system will be greater, and the ability to recover will be less. And so ultimately, at some time in the future, the effects of sea level rise will outweigh the effects of sediment supply, and we'll end up with net retreat of that dune. And that's what our coastal erosion modelling predicts for us with sea level rise over the next 100 years. Coastal erosion will also affect the various harbours and bays of the peninsula. In some places, that erosion will not cause issues. In other areas, where it may be up to 30 to 50 metres over 100 years, it will affect access to various communities. Our cliffs are also going to be prone to increased coastal erosion due to sea level rise. We're going to get more frequent wave attack, and we would expect that over 100 years that they could retreat in the order of 20 to 30 metres. So one of the issues with sea level rise is increasing groundwater close to the coastal environment, and that happens because the sea is higher, and therefore all our gravity outfalls don't discharge as well. This one here at Akaroa, in 60 years, it'll be covered by the tide 50% of the time. So that its ability to discharge that stormwater reduces, and we're likely to have more ponding, more water around our roads and within our sections. And if we look forward to 100 years, it's going to be covered by the tide 80% of the time. So really reduced efficiency in being able to discharge stormwater, rain, those sorts of things from the coastal environments behind the beach. We need to have conversations with all of our coastal communities within the district about how they might respond and manage those threats from coastal flooding, coastal erosion and raised groundwater.
So I'm just going to pass over to Derek now, who, as we've touched on, was the technical reviewer of the Coastal Hazard Assessment. We just thought it was a really good opportunity to have the person that critiqued the assessment here, so you can ask some of the similar questions, but he'll just touch on some of those methodology aspects about what we did in our assessment, and then just very briefly skim over some of the impacts because we've talked about them already.
I'm a coastal scientist, and while I didn't do the work, I was involved in the technical review all the way through. So that meant every couple of weeks I met with the people that were doing the work, and I got the chance to question what they were doing around the methods. So most of those questions were around the models that they used, were they appropriate? And around the assumptions that went into those models. So are those assumptions, do they stack up? And what they're trying to do for the Christchurch coast, does it make sense? And then about the data that they were inputting into the models. is it the most appropriate and best data that we've got? And I can say at the end of that process that I am confident that we have a robust process to measure what coastal hazards are for Canterbury. For Christchurch, sorry, not all of Canterbury. And to give you a bit of background of where I come from and that, I've been involved in coastal science for nearly 40 years. I did my first sea level rise assessment 20 years ago, and for the last 5 years I've exclusively been doing it for districts and regions around New Zealand. So it's not something that I just do in the meantime. I do this just about 100% of my working day. So what have we done differently? And the first part was that robust testing. Rather than coming in at the end and just reading the report, I was, as I said, involved all the way through. So I was able to ask critical questions. And if you want to see a list of those questions and assumptions, Mikey tells me they are in the review.
On the website, if you go to the Coastal Hazard Assessment 2021, there's a link to the technical review, and it's got Derek's sign-out memo, and then there's all the questions that were raised throughout the process.
So there's a register of the questions that we asked over the whole process. And I was joined in that review by Justin Cope, who is the coastal scientist for Environment Canterbury, and Justin has around 30 odd years experience himself. So between us we were asking quite critical questions about the methods that were being done. The second thing that we've done differently is these increments of sea level rise rather than just one rise. And so those increments run from the lowest projections, they do run from the 2.6 projections through to the 8.5 plus projections, right? For inundation, it doesn't matter what time scale we put on that, because it's just the sea level rise regardless of what time. It's what will that sea level rise effect be? But for erosion, because the extra parts of erosion are dependent on the rate of rise, you do need to put time frames. So that's why when you see the slider, there is time frames of 2050, 2080, 2130, and there's a stress test through to 2150. Now those increments cover that, as I said, that full range. Now the reason why it covers the full range is that is the guidance that comes out from the Ministry of Environment that should be used in assessments. That you don't just pick one, you don't just pick a 4.5 or a 6 scenario. You assess the lot. It's what happens with that assessment and the discussions that they have with you as communities about that guide what might happen in the adaptation and the district planning response to it. So the assessment must follow, or should follow, that direction, and it has, to give the full picture of all of the possible scenarios. Now yes, there has been an update from IPCC in 2021, which came out after this report. We have looked at those new scenarios and looked at how they weight to those increments, and they still fit within that. All right. Now the IPCC, I appreciate Warwick spending some time on the IPCC latest AR6 assessment and the 8.5 scenario. Those two quotes were quotes not from the IPCC themselves, they were quotes from people, and as you saw, they were quotes from other reports. The IPCC themselves, and remembering that's 700 scientists, and particularly the part that we're interested in is the sea level part, which those quotes did not come from. The sea level rise part says, as it did in that introduction, they can't put any likelihood on any of those scenarios. All of them have medium confidence of occurring. They do provide additional scenarios above that, just like the MFE do for 8.5 plus, but they say they have low confidence, right? And they're around greenhouse, ice shelf melt and things like that. So that full range that's in the assessment is still compliant to what IPCC say. So I say what the discussion around now and what the engagement with the community is about is which one of all of those do you take forward with, or do the city take forward with in their planning and adaptation. What wasn't in the erosion work previously was the sediment supply, and as Mikey said, NIWA did some work under another project about looking at what those ranges of sediment supply might be from the Waimakere area. It supplies the Christchurch coast. And their best estimate was status quo, but the range was that it could be 11% reduction in sediment coming to the Christchurch coast, or up to a 28% increase, because climate change has all sorts of changes in the catchment as well. So the modelling is mainly around the status quo, but there is stress testing, and you can see it on the web viewer if those ranges of sediment supply change. Right? Now, we won't know whether that's happening or not to some time in the future, whether that sediment supply changes. The other major thing that the erosion modelling did this time, which it didn't do last time, is it takes account of that the coast is currently accreting. It is currently building out. What happened in the previous assessments, it said, oh, we'll assume that's zero. In other words, from today it'll be zero. This assessment says, no, that accretion will continue for some time, right? Because the WIMAC will continue to provide sediment to you, all right? And therefore we can start to look at the tipping points where the erosion consequence of sea level rise may override the positive effects of sediment supply. Okay, and that's a major difference from the previous ones.
How are you going to monitor that?
That's something that they haven't addressed, but that's something the monitoring of shorelines is something that Environment Canterbury do. Okay, so they do have a quite extensive monitoring program. It is, in fact, probably the most extensive monitoring program in New Zealand in terms of their profile monitoring, and that's something that Environment Canterbury pick up.
So how frequently is that?
At the moment, it's done 6 monthly.
Okay, so that information is available?
Yes, and that information was used in this report. And as Mikey said, it includes all the Banks Peninsula, and that meant that we were looking at different sorts of shorelines, cliff shorelines, inlets, harbours, that wasn't in the past assessment. It's important to remember this is modelling. So we can only model as well as what the models give us. Right? And the models are not perfect. There will always be uncertainties. We have uncertainties about the amount of sea level rise, how much it's going to be and when it's going to be. So that's scenario uncertainty. Then we have modelling uncertainty. No model is perfect. Right? So there is limitations to those models. And as best possible, what we've done with the review is we've ensured that the best models have been used. Right? Now, some models are better than others in terms of some parts of it. And I'll talk a little bit about that when we come to looking at the results and what that mean, just very briefly. And then there is also uncertainty about the inputs you put into the model. So that's statistical uncertainty. I'll come to you in a minute, Dave. And so that is dealt with by putting probabilities on the results. And when you go to the web viewer, you'll see that there is different probabilities given for the amount of erosion that might occur. With the flooding, those different probabilities are around the return period of the sea level or the storm surge, what we call the storm tide, that is used. So in the past, they only used one storm tide. In this modelling, it is a 1-year event, a 10-year event, and a 100-year event. And they correspond roughly to something that might happen frequently, something that might happen occasionally, and something that's very rare. And all of those have been modelled. And we look at then what the sea level rise adds onto that to look at those change in frequencies. All right, so that's quite different. As much as possible, the modelling uses past model measured changes, but of course it's predictive, and then what we need to do is with our monitoring is test how well those predictions are going. All right, and that's something that needs to be done reasonably regularly to ensure that what we've predicted could happen and those limitations to reflect those. And where you get involved with those uncertainties is by being part of the discussion. how do you want to deal with about those uncertainties in the adaptation that you might look at, the pathway that you might take, or in the district planning.
Quickly as I can about the Coastal Adaptation Framework, which is essentially our proposed approach to undertaking adaptation planning. As I said before, there's a very long coastline, there's a lot of communities located along that coastline, so our proposal is that we undertake adaptation planning with tranches of communities, and we're calling those tranches of communities adaptation areas. And last year, Council agreed that we would start planning next year in the Littleton Harbour, the Whakaropo area. So that will be from essentially from Littleton right round through to Port Levy. We've produced the Coastal Adaptation Framework up front because we're wanting to be really transparent and seek feedback on our proposed approach. We've looked at other adaptation planning around the country, and where they haven't had an agreed approach up front, at times it hasn't been able to be implemented. So we think it's really important to be clear up front with our councillors as well as communities around how we're planning to go about this, and we definitely are seeking feedback on this, so please grab a copy and send us your thoughts. It's got three parts to it. The first is to set out Council's role, and our primary responsibility as Council is to manage the risks to our own assets, those assets that we manage for communities, which are the roads, the pipes, the wonderful venues like this, and the parks and reserves. We want to be really clear that we have no explicit legal obligation to protect individual private properties. So that's just something we want to be really clear about up front, so there are no misunderstandings. Private asset owners is similar. It's their responsibilities are for managing the risks to their assets. We've set out some guiding principles, and these are the headlines here, but if you read the document, you'll see a little more detail. I'll shoot through these relatively quickly. Partnership under the treaty is a really key principle for us, so we are working very closely with Ngāi Tahu Runanga, and as we move into those adaptation areas, we will be partnering with Runanga. It's really important to recognise that while the process we're trying to run is going to be similar right across the whole district, the outcomes will be different. So every community has a different scale of development, different local values, and different coastal environments. So adaptation pathways will differ from community to community. We're undertaking adaptation planning with whole communities, but we will be focusing any public funding on those public assets that underpin the health, safety and wellbeing of communities. So again, that's talking about the infrastructure that allows communities to thrive. We do recognise that some privately owned assets also perform similar services. So for example, marae, urupa, surf lifesaving clubs, there are some privately owned assets that also provide those functions for communities. So we're being a bit flexible about that. Speaking of being flexible, we are working in a climate of a lot of uncertainty. We have no exact understanding of how these impacts will occur. We are in a moving statutory environment at the moment, and we don't know what kinds of technologies might emerge in the future. So our whole process has to be quite adaptable, which essentially means being really open-minded about what we might put into an adaptation pathway, looking at a range of different options and different scenarios, as we've talked about already. Recognising intergenerational equity issues is a really important principle for us. The IPCC report said that sea level rise will continue for centuries, if not millennia. So the impacts really won't be hugely hitting us, they'll hit our children and our grandchildren. And so we want to make sure that we are prioritising adaptation options and adaptation pathways that minimise and reduce the burden on future generations. So that's something we're very interested to hear back from people on. The last two principles here relate to something Warwick touched on earlier, which is the New Zealand Coastal Policy Statement, which provides us with a lot of guidance. We are required to prioritise natural and nature-based options over those hard protection options. Doesn't mean we won't do hard protection, but we need to have eliminated those natural and nature-based options first. And keeping managed retreat on the table is also from the New Zealand Coastal Policy Statement. We're not saying that retreat is the only option, it's not a predetermined option, it just is something we all have to discuss. And the intention behind that is because if it does have to happen, we really want to understand how communities see that happening. It's not something we want to, I guess we've experienced a retreat in the city, and it was a challenging one with the red zoning. So this is about if we end up in that space, how do we best go about doing it? You've seen my slide because Warwick nicked it. But this is essentially our proposed engagement and decision-making process. So, as Warwick has described, we will be setting up a coastal panel that will differ for each adaptation area. The coastal panel for the Whakaropo Littleton Harbour will be different to the one that will be established on the side of the hill. when we come and work here. The intention with that is it has 6 community representatives, Runanga representatives, there'll be a community board rep, a zone committee rep, and we also have the opportunity to put some rest of city representatives on that. So one of our requirements is that we have 2 young people on the coastal panel. If, for example, we couldn't get 2 young people in the community representatives in Whakaropo, we could put 2 rest of city reps on to balance that gap. So it's really about creating that diversity of voice in the coastal panel. They are lay people, and we think that's really a valuable part of this. We want people with networks in their communities to be involved in these processes. We are also establishing a STAG, a Specialist and Technical Advisory Group, and that's a multidisciplinary group of experts who will provide guidance to the coastal panel. STAG don't vote, the coastal panel will be making the decisions and undertaking the analysis, but the Specialist and Technical Advisory Group will have engineers, scientists, planners, ecologists, economists, public health medicine specialists, people with the expertise to help guide the conversation. The proposed approach is that an independent chair looks after this process, and that at certain points in the process we go back out to the wider community and check back in, make sure that the decision making and the analysis by the coastal panel is informed by wider community views. Attached to the coastal adaptation framework is our catalogue of coastal hazard adaptation options, and this is essentially, I think we've got copies of this as well outside. No, it's on our website, and it's a really cool document that I'd really encourage you to have a look at, because you can see all of these different options here that have been used in adaptation processes in New Zealand or around the world. And each of them has some benefits and some trade-offs. Some of these are more expensive. Some of them are better for the environment. Some of them will impede access to beaches in the future. So it's about understanding the full range, and I guess looking at the opportunities we have here in the future to create adaptation pathways that will have benefits not just for the community but for maybe the environment. No one adaptation pathway will only have one option. There will be a mix and range of those. So I'd really encourage you to have a read of that document. We are only one part of the puzzle at Council, so we know that central government has been talking about its Climate Adaptation Act, and the intention is for that to go to the House in 2023. We don't have much information about it yet. The policy scope will be aired early next year, but we do know that it's to address the complex legal and technical issues associated with managed retreat and funding and financing adaptation. So we're all waiting with bated breath to see essentially what the government puts forward. We've heard 2 things. One is that there's likely to be a group of parties involved in any approach, which would be local central government, private property owners, potentially insurers as well. So all of us have a part of the mix. And there has been some discussions around whether they might set up an EQC-like entity or something like that to guide managed retreat. But as I say, there's nothing, and I know that EQC-like entity is not a great thing to drop in Christchurch, but they are obviously looking at different models and how they might go best about managing these complex issues, because these impacts will occur right across our country and of course right across the world. We often get asked about insurers, and we have been talking to the Insurance Council of New Zealand. We've developed a fact sheet with them, and we do have copies of that outside. It's the red one, and essentially the Insurance Council are saying, look, they're pricing risk all the time. Insurers will probably make some decisions around some level of full or partial retreat in some places. But what they have said is where the insurers can see councils and communities and Runanga and other stakeholders working together to actively manage and avoid some of the risks, manage known risks and avoid new risks, it gives them confidence in the market. So it may be the difference between retreat and staying in the market, and that's pretty much what they have said to us. Regional government is also a key player. ECAN is going to be notifying their Regional Coastal Environment Plan and their Regional Policy Statement in 2024, so there is also going to be some movement from them. Okay, I will now pass on to Mark.
Good evening. So I'm just going to provide an overview of the plan change and the process we're working through for that. As Warwick touched on, we have a gap in the current district plan, and that gap is that we don't currently implement national and regional direction. the district plan doesn't map the full extent of the area identified as subject to coastal hazards, as identified in the Tonkin and Taylor report, and it also doesn't manage all activities that are subject to coastal hazards. So as a consequence, there's a risk of development occurring without appropriate controls. We don't work in a vacuum and need to implement that national and regional direction. The national direction comes in a document called the New Zealand Coastal Policy Statement, and the regional direction comes in a document produced by Environment Canterbury called the Regional Policy Statement. And both those documents signal that we should be avoiding putting people and property in harm's way. So we need to reflect that in the district plan. As some of you may recall, we proposed some years ago to introduce policies and rules in the district plan through a comprehensive review of the whole of the plan. That was withdrawn. It wasn't considered appropriate to be subject to a fast-track process, and we've drawn on lessons from that. So what are we doing differently this time? I'll start by saying that we're starting slowly and taking a staged approach rather than going out with a draft set of objectives, policies and rules. It's still the issues and options paper that you can get a copy of on the table out there is still very high level. It's our ideas about how activities are managed, but the conversation is really about getting your feedback and understanding what you think is the best approach. Some of you, if not all of you, have no doubt experienced use of the district plan and how the regulation affects you, and so you're well placed to give us feedback on what's working well from your perspective, what's not, and how can we build on what's working effectively. With this stage in the process, the issues and options stage, there's a lot of flexibility and the opportunity to consider any feedback. It doesn't come down to whether there's scope and submissions to make changes, and by no means have we got a set of objectives, policies and rules in our back pocket. So it's very much an open conversation, being honest with you about the direction of travel we're putting forward, but recognising that all options are on the table. A second point I just want to make is that in the past, the district plan has been seen as a barrier or impediment to development, and an example of that is often cited in terms of tiny houses. The district plan treats tiny houses like other types of housing. Now there's an opportunity for us to be on the front foot and to enable development, innovative forms of development that rather than being an impediment, the district plan can enable. So it's about, if it's the right thing to do, we want to enable it rather than restrict it. The third point that's different from last time is that we're putting forward a preferred option that's targeting, putting in place regulation that reflects the level of risk. That's quite distinct from the last time when we proposed more of a blanket approach to how we manage risk. So in the issues and options paper, there's 4 different options, and those options include a preferred option. We think it's appropriate to be open and honest with you about a direction of travel, but by no means are we fixed to that. It's a conversation about options, and so if you think there's alternative ways of managing risks of coastal hazards, we want to know about it. So please give your feedback. Now, in terms of the options, they range in a spectrum from restrictive through to permissive. The status quo is at the more permissive end. We've not put it forward as an option in the issues and options paper for the very reason that it doesn't implement the requirements of national and regional legislation. So hence the 4 options are a do minimum approach, which is at the more permissive end, a risk-based approach, which is preferred, and I'll talk to shortly. And then at the more restrictive end, it's about avoidance, so a more blanket approach, and that would make it more difficult to obtain resource consent for development and subdivision in areas identified at risk. So in terms of the risk-based approach, our preferred option, it separates separates, in terms of flooding, it separates areas of the district according to the level of risk. So we've identified on the image on the right there's different colours, the red representing higher risk areas, and moving out from that, the paler green and blue represents lower risk areas. So rather than treating it all the same, we think a more nuanced approach is appropriate. Now, in defining those areas of risk of flooding, we have had to make assumptions and taken what is in the Tonkin and Taylor report and made decisions about what level of sea level rise is appropriate to use. And for defining these areas, we've considered 0.6 of a metre of sea level rise. There's a reasonable level of certainty of 0.6 of a metre across all the IPC scenarios. So whether it's 4.6 or 8.5, there's a reasonable level of certainty that there'll be 0.6 of a metre of sea level rise at some point in the future. The risk-based approach of distinguishing different areas of risk recognises that the risk isn't the same in every location, and the level of regulation that we'd put forward in any plan change would be reflective of that. So it's trying to take a balanced approach of enabling development in areas of lower risk and enabling people to meet their needs and well-being whilst ensuring it's safe to do so. So in areas of higher risk, it may necessitate a more restrictive approach, but that's having regard to the level of risk. We are cognizant, though, that the levels of risk will change in time, and reflecting the longer-term nature of climate change, there may be areas that are not at risk now that could be in the future. So areas that may not be experiencing any flooding now could experience flooding in the future. I've spoken about flooding. We've also proposed methods for managing areas of erosion, and the extent of the areas subject to erosion over the long term are far less than the areas identified for flooding, and that reflects the nature of the risk, but the consequences of erosion can be high. So we need to consider controls on development in areas at risk of erosion, appreciating that that land may not be there in the longer term. Of course, this is a conversation, and it's not about just what we've put forward and getting your feedback on that. It's about the full range of options. So the question has come up in the past of why are we proceeding with this consultation? Why are we proceeding with any plan change, given what you may have heard about in terms of reforms of the resource management system, the government's package to throw out the RMA. Now, the government has signalled 3 new pieces of legislation to replace the Resource Management Act, which would see introduced over next year and the year after. Notwithstanding that, we still see value of proceeding with this engagement. We think, given the risks in the future, that we need to start a conversation now, and in that context, there's still direction in place at the present time with the New Zealand Coastal Policy Statement to avoid putting people and property in harm's way, and we're anticipating that that direction will form part of the future reforms. The wording in that future legislation is unknown at this point in time, but the government have signalled that any existing national direction will be consolidated. So they're not talking about throwing out all direction and starting from a blank sheet. The other point to make is that whilst the new legislation signals that a district plan will be no more in time, there will still be a need for a plan for how we manage land use, development and subdivision. And so this conversation can feed into that. And of course, that will take time to prepare. So what feedback we receive now will potentially be of benefit to a plan change to the district plan as opposed to a future plan. Jane spoke about, made the reference to private property. That was in the context of adaptation planning. Under the Building Act and the Resource Management Act, Council does have a responsibility to manage activities that occur in areas of risk. So with reference to the Resource Management Act, Council can put conditions on a subdivision or consider the risk of hazards and whether to grant subdivision consent or not. So there is scope in the Resource Management Act in that context, and I understand, although I'm not an expert on the Building Act, that there is similar provision that building consent may not be granted if there's a significant risk of hazards. That reference to private property was really in the context of adaptation planning.
Any other questions? Yeah. So the question's about access, and one of the conditions of when you're building a house is will you be able to have access in a flood scenario, I guess. And so the question is, that might be pertain to a particular section, but what about some other properties, say on the hills, that are indirectly affected by access? So for example, Sumner gets flooded in the flat area and the hill areas are unable to access services. Is that being taken account in some of the adaptation and coastal planning?
Yes, so the adaptation planning program, we undertook a process of identifying those adaptation areas that I talked about before. So if you take the Littleton Harbour as an example, some of the areas, say in Diamond Harbour, are quite high up, but a lot of those people will be using the same road. So we are looking at adaptation areas as ones that have similar coastal environments, maybe similar community linkages, but also where there are access dependencies. So we would be considering how people are able to get in and out of their houses as part of adaptation planning. Absolutely, that's a key part of it, yeah.
So I guess your work there, Jean, is to say that people on the hills actually need to be part of the conversation, because they may not be affected directly on their properties, but if they don't have access to their properties, then that could also affect them in the long term. Daryl?
Thank you. I would imagine that many of the Sumner residents here this evening will be thinking in terms of maybe adaptive management approaches and saying, what is it that can happen in Sumner to protect our village and protect our investment? We have a sea wall out of the front there that may not necessarily last for hundreds of years, but in the medium to short term, looking at shoring up our sea wall and joining it up with the other work that's been done around Beachville Road, etc., which I understand has been built to a standard that allows for a degree of sea level rise. My question on behalf of residents and as a community board member for the area is, in terms of an adaptive management approach, is that regarded by the council as being a feasible option?
So at the moment we're engaging on our policy framework and our settings, which are intended to be applied district-wide. So we're not at the point in the process in which we are identifying solutions for communities up front, because as we've just described tonight, we see that as a conversation with communities, and we also see there as a range of options that can be used for adaptation planning. So I'm not going to stand here tonight and give you a proposed approach for Sumner. That would be well and truly preemptive. But what we are hoping that you will engage with is the policy settings and the approach for engaging with communities to come to those decisions at the right point in the process.
I think one of the other things to remember is the information that you've heard tonight is from all parties is to actually help you feedback. And so even though when you look at the coastal, to look at the plan change, it looks quite technical. Even when you look at the options, it's about avoid, mitigation, all of those sorts of things. And a lot of people think, how can I meaningfully feed back on that? Because I actually am not a planner. But I think what Mark said is important in that think about what a good policy would look like for you and for your community. And especially if you've built here before, what does a good policy look like? Does it look like that you can build adaptive housing? Does it look like that you can extend your house if you need to? If your house burnt down, can you rebuild it? Can you use more adaptive building styles? Is that a good policy? What does a bad policy look like to your community, and what would be the adverse effects on that? If you can think about your feedback in those ways, you're actually bringing something quite meaningful to the feedback. and it doesn't have to be in planning speak to bring that back. And so every community will have different experiences.
That would likely support the solutions.
So again, it's a little preemptive to be asking that question. What we are doing with the catalogue of options that I mentioned before is providing some guidance around the different costs of different options, because some options, as I said before, are more expensive than others. You can't cost something until you know what it is. And so we again are still at that point in the process before having that engagement and that conversation with communities. Those conversations with communities will produce preferred adaptation pathways, and they will come to council for a decision. If there is a decision that those require public funding, then that will go into the LTP process. So at the moment in this process, we are simply looking at the range of options and the approach that we're going to be undertaking with communities, as opposed to pricing the outcomes of those conversations we haven't had yet, basically. Yeah.
And folks, do remember there's two types of feedback. Remember, there's one about the plan change and one about the adaptation framework. So they're quite sort of separate things. One's about development in your area and one is about how we're going to handle coastal hazards. So if you think about them in those two terms, it can help you with your feedback. At the back.
I was just wondering, in talking to some of the neighbours in my area, I find that a number of people are not really aware of this conversation taking place, and I'm wondering if the council has a sense as to the depth of this knowledge getting out to those communities, and then if the amount of feedback doesn't quite hit some bar that you've actually touched all the people out there to make sure they're aware. I think even some of the questions kind of point to there's a lot of need to have an understanding on how to give feedback at this point. So I'm a little concerned as to how many people are in the community.
Yeah, and look, valid question, and always a challenge for engagement at council. How do we get people involved? We've tried all the channels that we have available to us. We've gone as far as wide as we can. We are relying very heavily this time on being invited to other people's parties. Case in point, tonight, thank you very much CCRU for inviting us and coming along. We're doing that with other residents associations and trying to do that because we know that gets better traction than if we try to just have people turn up to our drop-ins. We've, as we've mentioned earlier, we've tried really hard with those resources on plain language to make it as accessible as possible. But you know, the rub is like we're always up against time and a desire to see things happening, a desire to move things along, yet also making sure that people have an opportunity to have their say. We're sort of like, this is early in the process, and we hope that we'll be able to continue to engage people in the process. We don't want this dragging on too long though, so we've considered, I guess, a finite period of time. If there's anything else you can think of, any other way, any other suggestions that you have for how we can get the word out, I'd love to hear about it.
Something that Warwick said earlier, just from what I'm listening to, it's like 2 weeks we have submissions, you know, another couple of weeks to get in by the November. To me, it's all just going too quickly because you need to probably do maybe a joint. You need to find out first if the IPCC 2021 is going to be taken into account, because at the moment you're racing, doing everything on the 2014 report, and is it 2014, something like that. So I would think that you might need to actually take a breath before continuing on and find out exactly if the Ministry of the Environment might give an indication that you might need to use the best data possible, which is the latest one. And I wonder if it's possible to do maybe a joint, you know, push on that with CCRU or something, and try and get them to come up with something, because otherwise there's going to be a lot of work being done, a lot of submissions all for nothing.
Yeah, I'll try and clarify on that point a wee bit. So when the latest report came out, we got both Derek and Tonkin and Taylor to do a quick look through and go, look, what does this change substantially for those RCPs? Are we still broadly on track? there is sort of a slight increase generally about the amount of sea level rise per RCP and the time frame it lines up with. But broadly, they're still within the range of those increments that we've measured. So we've got the right kind of information for those more recent projections coming out. In terms of the national space and those updates and direction, from conversations that we've heard to date, we're not expecting any substantial throwing out of an 8.5 or anything like that. So, you know, just to give you a really honest, upfront signal, we expect to look at it and do some tweaks, but we're not expecting substantial changes. Yeah.
And we are just engaging on the approach at the moment. So these are both approaches. It's not the definitive word. As Mark said, there's no rules, there's no objectives, there's nothing set in stone at the moment. What we're saying is, are we travelling in the right direction? How would you like to work together on these problems?
It seems like RCP 8.5 is set as the preferred to deal with adaptive risk management. And I'm a little disturbed, I suppose, that the process didn't actually give the community some opportunity to discuss whether RCP 8.5, 6, 4.5 or whatever should be the preferred start point from where we set off. So that's my first point. I think that a lot of people in the community feel a little aggrieved that council have already set the bar of where they want to start from. My second concern really comes around the computer modelling area, where we talk about a lot of assumptions and data and models aren't perfect. What I would like to see the community have access to is the modelling process. What are the assumptions are made? What are the margins of error in a lot of these modelling? And where is the data coming from that we are using in this modelling? It may be available, but I certainly would like to see it more publicly available. And from my experience, I've seen computer modelling back in 1995, and sorry Derek, you were involved in this, where sometime later we found that there was a margin of error in the wave period in this model of plus or minus 30%. And that had a huge impact, would have had a huge impact on the final outcome. So I'm very keen to see some paper put out that gives some clarity around the computer modelling, the assumptions made, the margins of error of the various modelling precepts, and where this data is coming from. And just before you answer the question, I suppose, I'd like to see some more empirical data that specifically relates to our coastline. And years ago we should have been putting more emphasis on gathering data, but we seem to use data from similar coastlines, and that further impacts on the margins of error. So that's where I want to.
Thanks for your comments, Dave. My first point would be, please put in a submission. You've got a lot of strong opinions about what you want us to be doing, and the easiest way we can respond to them is if we've got them. My second point would be, if you want to understand some of those things, you will actually need to read the technical report. You've got a lot of questions around there which we have outlined in our different forms of information. We've got shorter forms, we've got longer forms, so go read it, see if it answers some of your questions. Read Derek's technical review as well. We have a robust process in there, so we were asking a lot of those questions. Have a look through, see if it answers those for you.
We're engaging with the community on how the district plan could manage coastal hazards, but you already have a preferred option. How can we as a community be assured, A, that we're not just going down a track where the engagement is leading us into a predetermined outcome, and B, that the submissions and the points that the community raised will have a meaningful process to be included in a further adaptation of the preferred option.
Thanks, Dave. Question.
Good question, thank you, David. The indication of I can give you my assurance that we're open to consideration of any option that you put forward. We put forward a preferred option to be open and honest about initial thinking around our preferred way forward, but that doesn't by any means mean that we've made up our minds, that there's been no decisions made that is what we will take forward. I can't emphasise that enough. Notwithstanding that, I should make it clear that the national and regional direction that we have is quite directive. It's, to paraphrase, it seeks to avoid increased risk of harm to people, property, and in fact, harm is as broad as could be interpreted in the context of the New Zealand Coastal Policy Statement. Now, one of the reasons we've put forward, it's not just about being open and honest about our preferred thinking, it's also to avoid unnecessary concern that we may have gone down the same path that we went down in 2015 of a blanket approach. In 2015, what we put forward in the district plan review was an area was defined at risk in over 50 years, and a line further inland from that was identified at risk over 100 years. Within each of those bands, there was a single approach applied. So within the 50-year band, I think from memory, it was non-compliant for any subdivision. We don't think that that blanket approach is the best from our initial work, but as I said, all options are on the table. We don't believe that heavy-handed avoidance approach is the most appropriate. We're initially putting forward what we think is a good idea, but we can't say that we've got everything right, so we want to understand what you think is the best approach and why.
Mark, I've got a question while you're standing there. You know, you had the slide up there that had the continuum and it had the status quo and all the options there. And I certainly understand that you're saying that the status quo doesn't cover the coastal policy statement because there's some outlier areas now that are now within that area that need some planning because and so for those areas, they'll move from a fairly unrestrictive building to perhaps some restrictions. Mm. What about some of those areas, say for example, South Shore and perhaps even Red Cliffs and those areas which actually do have quite restrictive regimes already. So while they're in the status quo group, they're already quite a ways down the continuum. So for those communities, how do they feed back on knowing, not understanding where they sit, right? How do they know where you're going with it when they don't know where they are? And like I say, some communities will not be within that, and so that might see quite dramatic changes. But for example, some like the Red Cliffs, Esplanade and Red Cliffs area and maybe South Shore and some of those areas already pretty restrictive. Would you imagine from the feedback that they might not need a lot of tweaking because they're already there, they already need resource consents, they already need certain types of building? Are you taking that into account?
We will be. It's too early to say what it will mean in terms of those existing layers, but we don't want to create complexity in the district plan by having a high flood hazard management area and then an overlay of coastal flooding representing high as well. We think, well, there's an objective in the district plan about it being clear, concise, that it's easy to use, and we want to achieve that objective so that it's clear, but also it's not a build-up of different layers when it could be achieved by a single layer.
Can I add to that too? And it's something you mentioned earlier, Karina, and it's about your experience and how useful that is for us to understand. So your experience of what it's like to live in South Shore with those rules is very helpful in sort of like determining policies. So your feedback could be what you think good policy would look like, what you think bad policy would look like, and that would also be very valuable for us to hear. Thank you.
I was just wondering about managing the community feedback process, so that is probably what you do. Sort of paint a picture for me of a group in a room, and just take the last example of the road to Sumner. Wouldn't every community say, build a nice big road over the hill and put a big wall around us and let us continue, that's what we'd like, let's continue building like we are. Isn't that the feedback you're going to get?
But again, we're talking about the approach that we're taking. We're not talking about adaptation planning yet with communities. We're simply talking about those guiding principles, the roles and responsibilities, and the panel, the process that we're going to take. So we're not at that point of doing the adaptation planning.
Right. So if we step back from that, so this approach, can you give me like a room, kind of picture of that room and how it would be in real life?
As in, I'm sorry.
In terms of the approach, what do you sort of mean by that?
So what feedback can you give about the guiding principles? Are they on the money? Are they things that you want us to take forward in adaptation planning? Is that what you mean? It's like, the roles and responsibilities, have we missed anything? Have we gone too far? Have we not gone far enough? In the decision-making process, are there enough steps in that process for communities to have their say? Have we got the right balance there between, the coastal panel, STAG, and opportunities for the wider community to have their say? Is that answer your question, Mike? I'm not
so
sure.
Basically, what you're really talking about at this stage is the structure of the process.
Yes, yep, absolutely. This is the approach. This is not adaptation planning. This is not the plan and change. These are the approaches that we're going to take working with community as we begin those processes. We said earlier, this is early doors, early stages in the process. We've learned some lessons, we've come here early, and the rub with that means that we don't have all the answers at this point. That's always the challenge. Go too early, don't have all the answers. People want the answers, don't have them because it's too early. So we're just trying to get that balance there by saying you're in here early to give your feedback to help shape how we're going to take this further.
Can I ask a question, Katie? With that in mind, then, the maps that we're showing right now that show where there is high risk, and that high risk is based on a number that has now been identified by council, or a range of number that is being identified by council for your preferred planning path. But we're being asked to answer questions if we feel comfortable about an approach when we don't feel comfortable with what the map is actually showing us at the moment. So what I'm wondering is, a little difficult to answer questions when we feel like we've come in late to the meeting, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So we're answering questions about how you'll conduct stuff with us, and that's great. But if you've already decided on what it is you're gonna conduct, it's hard for us to engage that, if that makes sense. I hope that makes sense.
So if you think we haven't quite got it right with those maps, if you think the high risk, those areas, if you want to provide feedback on the scenarios, please do. This is your opportunity. Those maps are for guidance. They are not the definitive word.
So then that would be my question. As further information comes out, as the ICPC, whatever that report is, and everybody's looked at it and they say, well, actually, there's some content here we need to engage. Yeah. You're saying then that part of what you're talking about is still open for conversation.
As I understand it, that's part of the joy of working with the incremental approach, isn't it, Mikey?
Yeah, I mean, that analysis for the district plan maps, if we went out with no maps, you'd be going, well,
what is high
risk? What is high risk? Where are you talking to us about? So we've done an initial analysis, we've said this is where we could draw the lines. If we've got it completely wrong, let us know. You know,
but that's not my question.
Yeah.
So I'm asking you, is it
maybe if we've got it a slight bit wrong, let us know. You know,
or if new information comes to hand.
Yep. I'm just saying, is it a topic that's still open?
Yeah.
Because is it closed? It's
not closed. Until the district plan is actually notified, there's still opportunities to change those maps.
And just to go through that process again, issues and options paper informs the draft plan change. Draft plan change informs the notification of the plan change.
But the reality of it is that those maps and those lines are affecting
people now with their insurance, isn't it? So that's the reality for the people on the ground. So it may be something going to change in the future, but they're suffering with that now.
I think you've hit the nail on the head, because it's communities, and I think I read somewhere that starting in Littleton and going up to Waikuku, and I might be slightly out here, it's going to be done over a 10-year period. That's a hell of a lot of uncertainty for communities who are going to be placed in limbo. And you know, I look around this room and I see more people at the Sumner Rugby Club on a Saturday night. So is it about the message? Now I know, you know, it's hard to distill that message. I certainly understand what you're saying. You start talking to people out here in any coastal community about equity erosion and lack of ability to get insurance down the path, and you'll have a full house. And many questions that you wouldn't be able to answer, because you know, it seems to me that this data has been gathered over a long period of time, and you know, I certainly don't envy you for having to get the message out there, but there seems something wrong with the construct, and I think this has been put together over a long period of time, and yet the communities have got, what, 5 weeks? And then at the same time, I mean, you know, let's say for example, I decided to put a port on my house in summer tomorrow and build. You know, obviously I've got to take a risk-based approach to that, but you know, in 5 years' time or 10 years' time, when my exit plan is to sell that house when my kids get older, I know this is a personal one, how do I know that I can get insurance? How do I know that there's a market for the house? I think that they're the fundamental issues that face people in these communities. A, equity erosion, B, ability to get insurance, and C, literally having the heart potentially of the community ripped out. And I don't think any of this actually talks to that. I hear a lot of high-level scientific speak, but I don't hear a lot of layperson speak. And I think if it was pitched differently, and I think the lady kind of talked to it before, you'd see a lot more people in the room and you'd see a lot of outrage.
And you're quite right in the sense, Kim said that the lines that are on the maps are impacting people now. I had a phone call from a colleague today who lives on the South Shore, concerned about 2 people who have had their house insurance withdrawn. So that's the real impact based on the lines on the map.
So the devil is in the timeframes a lot, so we know that to have these conversations with communities, we need to spend time for adaptation planning. When we're talking about long-term conversations with communities, we need to take time to have those conversations. We need to work with communities, that takes time, to get a long-term plan. If we came at, however, in that space of time there is uncertainty, it is a really hard thing to do, and we've been really upfront about that. The reason we're going out with a plan change at the same time is we're trying to provide some certainty in terms of new builds that are happening, so the problem isn't necessarily being made worse in the meantime. So there's 2 pieces of work, and there's sort of 2 bits of base information that inform those. The hazard maps on the portal are going to go on limb notations after we've finished this engagement period. That is something that we are legally required to do. But we are going to hold off with those district plan high, medium, low maps until we know we've got it right, until we notify that plan change. So that is something that we need to be very upfront about and clear about. We, you know, if we're asked about it from insurance industries, we will be very upfront about that. We have, you know, they are indicative at this stage.
But most people will understand where the insurance company will go to. I mean, you'd have to be awfully naive to think that once these things end up on people's titles and risk areas are noted, that the insurers and insurance companies, most of them are international insurance companies, are going to put very restrictive insurance premiums on people. You know, you probably take it, I'm a bit of a cynic, you know, and you know, it gets me wondering, you know, we've seen in the news today about consultation, which suddenly has been eroded and is going to be mandated in the next, you know, thing. So I'm always careful about what I'm told. I'm also wondering why, you know, I think it was a good question about the hills before, because most people, if they've picked up on this through the media or through the thing, will think it's the coastal districts of, it's not, it's the hill suburb, it's most of the city. And, you know, the cynic in me says that the mapping hasn't been done right across the city, because the good people of all of Christchurch would be up in arms about this, not necessarily just the coastal communities. So
there's no ulterior motive behind the mapping, so that's probably all I can give you there. Probably just the other thing on insurers, they actually have their own information. They're making risk-based decisions every day. They have nothing to do.
I think we know that having lived in Canterbury through the earthquakes, but I mean, once official notifications are put on them, it does give insurance companies. I've talked to a colleague today in Taitako who's having to move from one insurance company to another, because one insurance company is pulling out the market generally, and she's been suggested to get in contact with another insurer, and when she's given the address of her property, they've said they're not insuring in that area. I think there's a lot of unknown out here, and I think most people would be fairly.
Please tell us as well if there are examples.
But I think that's the understanding. You've got to be pretty onto it to actually, sit here, give up your evening, understand and go through all the data.
Yeah.
Most people in this community, I'd suggest from Waikuku around to Littleton, don't have the, I'm sure they'd love to have the time and inclination, but they just don't have the ability to distill this. Because it's, for me, there's quite a bit of baffle involved in it. I'm not saying it's not correct, but it's actually the ability to actually read through a 150-page report, data check it against a whole bunch of other things and put it in a submission within a 5-week period. And I'm sure that you guys have been putting together your program over the last 5 weeks. It seems an unevenly balanced time frame, in my opinion.
Yeah. Well, if time frame is the real trick, then provide some feedback on that. But you'll be, that also means that things drag on as well. So, like adaptation planning is about it.
I think there's,
but if it drags on, we get the right outcome, isn't that the best process?
I just think there's a couple of disconnects here just a little bit. I think the adaptation planning is a different thing, but where the rubber meets the road is the district plan. And in like cases, that's the limb, is what goes on.
I'm sorry to interrupt, I think the rubber hits the road with people being able to unquantifiably not know what the equity erosion and or insurance ability is further down the track. And I think really, and I'm sorry to speak over you, but I think most people who are aware of this and are able to delve into it are worried about their personal position, their neighbour's position and their community's position. And in the end, it comes down to hard-working Kiwis who have put money into a house or an asset, who are worried that in X period of time down the track, it's worth significantly less because of this process, and or an insurer who won't provide them with the ability to have a market to sell.
And I think what we're saying, what from our experience, because CCRU has been talking about this for a long time with the council, we've been talking about that it should be a city-wide context. That's something that we've spoken over a long period of time. But one of the things is that whether you've got your RPC scenarios or whatever, it's really how the council responds to those. If at the end of the day they say actually in a high hazard area you can actually mitigate, you can do this, you can do that or whatever, then what does that mean? But if they say actually in a high area you can do nothing, then that does change your community. So the question for us as community members and for the council is how are you responding to that, and what rules will you put in place? Are you just saying that in 100 years' time we're actually planning for that, because we probably need to plan for it, so we've got a plan in our pocket, but in the meantime you can do this, this and this, it's permissible? Or are we planning for this now because we can see this happening in the future? So it's really, what is that response? And I think that's the confusion for the community, isn't it?
Yeah, I agree, and apologies for holding the floor again, but the lady said here, it's actually happening in the here and now. There's people probably building in Sumner now, and other coastal communities, who are building new houses to the tune of hundreds and thousands of dollars, who the council has given them the consent to build, and I'd suggest that there's quite a few of those people out there who, for work reasons or kid reasons or that, are not aware of this is going on. Now, their house may be completed in 6 months' time or a year's time, and these people suddenly become aware of this, and it's all unquantifiable at the moment. In 5 years' time, in 6 years' time, by the time we roll through all the discussions over the next 10 years, where do people sit? It's actually going to impact the here and now, the here and the tomorrow and the next week and in 6 months.
And they're great points, and that's the reason why we will need to feedback, really. And sorry to stop you, but just one last question, and then we might need to.
With regard to the information going on the limbs, you said that just after this consultation period, it will go on the limbs. So you're saying that as of November 15, after everybody has submitted, it's gonna go on the limbs?
So very general limb notation, you are in an area that could be impacted by coastal flooding or coastal erosion. Go online and check out the maps, not high, medium, low. Okay?
It's just referencing the report as we've done previously.
We are legally required once we have the hazard information.
I actually just want to step in now and say a huge thank you to Confronting, and also to the council as well. I think this, and to Warwick, I think there's been some really valid and interesting information that's come out, and I think what
backing up your point earlier on, I think it's really opening people's eyes to what's a really significant body of work. There is a drop-in session on Monday, so I think for anyone who's here wants to come back, that will spread the word around that. And of course there's that meeting in Redcliffe on Tuesday as well. So thank you very much for spending, your evenings and coming to talk to us. And we know that we're at the beginning of a long journey, so we'll just keep these communication channels open. Yeah.